The rain had returned to Ashford House on the very evening of Lady Pemberton's final ball of the season, as though the heavens themselves conspired to match the weight that pressed upon Catherine Ashford's heart. Through the tall windows of the withdrawing-room, she could see the carriages arriving in steady procession, their lanterns swaying like uncertain stars through the downpour, disgorging elegant ladies in silk and gentlemen in pristine evening dress. The season's last great gathering would unfold without her, as had so many others before it, though this absence carried a particular sting that made her fingers tremble as she attempted to focus on the embroidery in her lap. 6 seasons, 6 years of careful preparation, of hope carefully nursed and just as carefully extinguished, of standing against the wall in ballrooms that glittered with possibility for everyone but her. At 24, Catherine had become a fixture of the marriage mart's landscape, acknowledged with pitying glances, and avoided with the superstitious care one might show a cursed object. To dance with Miss Ashford was to invite speculation about one's own desperation. To court her was to announce to all of society that one's circumstances had become truly dire. She had learned to read the subtle signs, the way a gentleman's eyes would slide past her during introductions, the manner in which mothers steered their sons away from her corner of the room, the false brightness in the voices of those who bothered to acknowledge her at all. Her crime, as far as she could discern, was simply to exist without the armour of exceptional beauty or substantial fortune, to possess instead only a keen mind, a generous heart, and a face that could be called handsome in certain lights but never arresting. The door to the withdrawing-room opened, admitting her younger sister Lydia, resplendent in rose-coloured silk that complemented her golden curls and porcelain complexion to perfection. At 19, Lydia had already received 3 proposals in her first season, each more advantageous than the last, though she had accepted none, holding out for something that matched both her romantic inclinations and her substantial prospects. "Catherine," Lydia said softly, her voice carrying genuine concern that somehow made the situation more unbearable. "Are you quite certain you won't reconsider? Lady Pemberton specifically mentioned that you would be welcome." Catherine managed a smile that felt like paper stretched too thin. "How generous of her to extend charity to the spinster sister." "I think not, Lydia. I find I have little appetite for witnessing another season's conclusion from my usual vantage point against the wall." Lydia crossed the room in a rustle of expensive fabric and knelt beside Catherine's chair, taking her sister's hands in her own. "It isn't charity. You know that Lady Pemberton holds you in genuine regard, and there are always gentlemen attending who could, perhaps, see what I see when I look at you." But Catherine shook her head, gently extricating her hands. "Go, dearest. Enjoy yourself without the burden of monitoring my humiliation. I am quite content here with my needle and thread, and truthfully relieved to spare myself another evening of being overlooked." After Lydia departed, reluctance evident in every backward glance, Catherine set aside her embroidery and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The truth that she could never speak aloud, even to Lydia who loved her, was that each rejection had calcified something inside her, building walls where once there had been openness, creating a fortress of self-protection that grew higher with every averted gaze and dismissive introduction. She had learned to save herself the pain of hoping, to observe the marriage market as one might observe a play in which one had no role, and while this distance brought a measure of peace, it also confirmed what society already believed, that Catherine Ashford was a woman whose time had passed, if indeed it had ever arrived at all. The Ashford estate had once been among the most prosperous in the county, its land stretching from the river's edge to the northern woods, its coffers full from wise investments and careful stewardship. But her father's death 5 years prior had revealed the rot beneath the gleaming surface, debts accumulated through speculation gone wrong, mortgages taken against land that no longer produced what it once had, obligations that her brother Richard, now baronet, struggled to meet despite his best efforts. The family's genteel poverty was the kind that could be maintained through careful economies and strategic marriages, hence Lydia's importance to their collective futures, and hence also the increasing urgency with which Catherine's continued unmarried state was discussed in tense family councils she was not meant to overhear. She understood the calculations. A woman of 24 with no fortune and no extraordinary beauty, whose best years had been spent accumulating the stigma of repeated rejection, represented not an asset, but a drain on limited resources. The gowns she required for appearances, the servants who attended her, the food she consumed, all subtracted from what might be spent on Lydia's prospects, or Richard's attempts to restore the estate. She had become, without intending it, a burden, and the knowledge sat heavy as stone in her chest. The following morning arrived wrapped in fog so thick it rendered the gardens invisible from Catherine's bedroom window, transforming the familiar world into something uncertain and strange. She had slept poorly, her dreams populated by faceless figures who turned away each time she approached, by ballrooms that stretched into infinity while she remained fixed in place, by mirrors that showed her reflection growing progressively dimmer until she vanished entirely. Rising before her maid arrived, she dressed herself in a simple morning gown of grey muslin, its plainness a small rebellion against the effort that seemed increasingly futile. She was descending the stairs when Richard emerged from his study, his expression carrying a peculiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that immediately set her nerves on edge. "Catherine," he said, his voice too hearty, too carefully casual, "I'm glad I've caught you. Might we speak privately?" In the study, with its smell of leather and tobacco and the faint mustiness that spoke of insufficient funds for proper maintenance, Richard poured himself a brandy despite the early hour, a sign of agitation he could not quite conceal. "I've had a most extraordinary communication," he began, not meeting her eyes. "From the palace, actually. It seems Prince Frederick is to spend a month in the county, at Thornbridge Hall, and has requested introductions to suitable young ladies of good family." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I see. Lydia will be delighted, I'm sure. She mentioned just last evening that she'd heard rumours of His Grace's visit." Richard's discomfort intensified. "Yes. Well, the thing is, Catherine, the request was quite specific. The Prince has indicated a desire to meet ladies who are, and I quote, accomplished in matters beyond the superficial, who possess depth of character and intellectual substance. He apparently finds the usual debutantes rather." He paused, searching for the word, "tiresome." Catherine stared at her brother, comprehension dawning slowly, and then all at once with a heat that brought colour flooding to her cheeks. "You believe he might be interested in meeting me because I am old enough to be considered, serious, substantial, a blue-stocking who won't twitter at him about fashion and weather?" "I think," Richard said carefully, "that you are precisely what he claims to seek, and that this represents an opportunity that, Catherine, we cannot afford to dismiss. The connection alone, even if nothing came of it, would transform Lydia's prospects and restore the Ashford name to a position of relevance." There it was, laid bare with an honesty that was somehow worse than tactful evasion. The admission that she had become so desperate a case that even an unlikely royal interest could not be refused, regardless of how humiliating it might be to present herself like a curiosity, the learned spinster rolled out for a prince's amusement. Prince Frederick arrived at Thornbridge Hall on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks later, his procession modest by royal standards, but still sufficient to draw half the county to line the roads and stare. Catherine watched from an upstairs window as the carriages passed in the distance, visible as dark shapes through the persistent autumn mist that had replaced summer's clarity. She had agreed, after much persuasion from Richard and tearful entreaties from Lydia, who somehow believed this represented a fairy tale, opportunity rather than a farce, to attend the introductory gathering planned for the following week. In the intervening days, she submitted to fittings for new gowns they could ill afford, to Lydia's attempts to arrange her hair in more becoming styles, to her mother's anxious coaching on topics of conversation that might interest a prince. Through it all, Catherine felt herself observing from a distance, as though the woman being primped and prepared was someone else entirely, while her true self remained safely locked away where disappointment could no longer reach. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and cold, the first true breath of autumn cutting through the remnants of summer warmth. Catherine dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk, its colour chosen to complement her chestnut hair and the hazel eyes that were, she had been told, her best feature, though not sufficiently arresting to overcome her other deficiencies. The bodice fit well, the sleeves fell gracefully, and when she regarded herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who looked entirely appropriate for such an occasion, if not remotely memorable. Thornbridge Hall exceeded even its reputation for grandeur, its limestone facade glowing golden in the afternoon sun, its manicured grounds stretching toward distant follies and ornamental lakes. The drawing room into which the Ashford party was shown seemed designed to emphasize the inadequacy of lesser mortals, its ceiling soaring to impossible heights, adorned with frescoes depicting mythological scenes, its walls hung with masterworks that represented fortunes in themselves. Perhaps 24 families had been invited, Caroline noted, all of good name, even if their circumstances varied from the comfortable to the carefully concealed desperate. The young ladies present ranged from Lydia's age to her own, though most clustered at the younger end of the spectrum, their fresh faces and nervous excitement marking them as women for whom hope remained unbruised by repeated disappointment. They waited in a state of barely contained anticipation, conversation forced and high-pitched, until the doors at the far end of the room opened and a figure entered that required no announcement. Prince Frederick moved with the easy confidence of one who had never questioned his place in any room, yet there was something in his bearing that suggested thoughtfulness rather than arrogance, observation rather than performance. He was taller than Catherine had expected, his frame lean and athletic, beneath perfectly tailored clothing that managed to convey both formality and ease. His features were handsome without being pretty, his face marked by a strong jaw and intelligent grey eyes that swept the assembled company with an assessment that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. What struck her most in that first moment of observation was the sense of contained energy about him, as though he held himself in careful check, revealing only what he chose to show while keeping deeper currents hidden beneath a practiced surface. The introductions proceeded with excruciating slowness, each family presented in turn, each young lady curtsying and murmuring greetings, while the prince offered responses that were courteous but brief. Catherine watched him with a detachment born of certainty that this exercise held nothing for her, noting the way his attention seemed to drift during some interactions while sharpening during others, filing away observations, not because they mattered, but because her mind sought occupation to prevent anxiety from taking root. When the Ashford family's turn arrived, Richard made the presentations with evident nervousness, first introducing Lydia, whose curtsy was perfect, and whose smile held just the right combination of warmth and modesty. "Your Grace," Lydia said, her voice clear and pleasant, "we are honoured by your presence in our county." The prince inclined his head, offering some appropriate pleasantry that Catherine barely registered because she was focused on preparing herself for the inevitable moment of being passed over. The way his gaze would move through her as though she were made of glass, transparent and ultimately invisible. But then Richard was saying her name, and she was executing her own curtsy, deeper and more formal than Lydia's, because she had learned that technique could compensate for natural grace. And when she rose, she found herself looking directly into eyes that were not sliding past her, but fixed with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Catherine Ashford," the prince said slowly, as though tasting the syllables. "Richard mentioned that you are an accomplished scholar of history, particularly the medieval period, an unusual interest for a young lady." The comment could have been dismissive, another iteration of the polite mockery she had endured from countless gentlemen who found female learning threatening or absurd. But something in his tone suggested genuine interest rather than condescension, a quality Catherine could not quite name, but that resonated like a tuning fork struck in a silent room. "I find the period fascinating, Your Grace," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The tensions between emerging nation-states and feudal obligations created conflicts that resonate even in our modern age. The question of where power truly resides, with monarchs or with those who control land and resources, remains as relevant now as it was then. A smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief but unmistakable. A bold observation to make to a prince, Miss Ashford. Some might call it impolitic. "Then I must beg your Grace's pardon," Catherine said, though she did not lower her gaze. "I have been accused of many things, but rarely of being politic. It seems a skill I failed to acquire during my 6 seasons attempting to master the art of being overlooked." Beside her, she heard Lydia's sharp intake of breath, Richard's barely suppressed groan at such inappropriate candor. But Prince Frederick's smile deepened, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire countenance from merely handsome to something more compelling, more alive. "6 seasons," he repeated softly. "Then perhaps we have more in common than might be immediately apparent, Miss Ashford. I too have spent considerable time being overlooked, though for different reasons." Before she could ask what he meant, he had moved on to the next introduction, but twice during the remainder of the gathering, Catherine caught him glancing in her direction with an expression she could not quite decipher, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he had found something unexpected and was attempting to understand its significance. The invitation arrived 3 days later, delivered by royal messenger in a sealed envelope bearing the prince's personal crest. Catherine's hands trembled as she broke the wax and unfolded the heavy paper to reveal a request, phrased as such, though clearly a command, that she join Prince Frederick for a riding excursion through the northern woods on the following morning. The postscript, written in what she assumed was his own hand rather than a secretary's formal script, added that he hoped she would not feel obligated to be politic during their conversation, as he had found her candor refreshing beyond measure. The household erupted into barely controlled chaos. Lydia commandeered Catherine's wardrobe, selecting and rejecting riding habits with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign, eventually settling on a deep blue ensemble that made Catherine's eyes appear more green than brown. Richard vacillated between excitement at the opportunity and anxiety about what Catherine might say if left to her own devices with royalty. Their mother oscillated between tears of joy that one of her daughters had finally attracted significant notice and dread that Catherine's unfortunate tendency toward honesty would destroy everything before it could develop into anything substantial. Through it all, Catherine remained curiously calm, as though she had stepped outside herself and was watching these preparations from a great distance. She could not quite believe that Prince Frederick's interest was genuine rather than a momentary curiosity that would fade upon further acquaintance, yet something in his eyes during their brief exchange had suggested a depth she had not anticipated, a quality of attention she had stopped expecting from any quarter. She dressed with care the following morning, allowing herself neither hope nor despair, but simply moving through each task with focused precision. And when she descended to find a royal groom waiting with 2 magnificent horses, one a grey gelding and the other a chestnut mare with intelligent eyes, she mounted with more confidence than she felt, and allowed herself to be led toward an encounter whose consequences she could not yet imagine. The northern woods wrapped around them like a cathedral, ancient oaks and beeches forming a canopy that filtered the autumn sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow across the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, that particular scent of things breaking down to nourish what would come next, and the only sounds were their horses' steady progress along the path and the occasional call of birds settling into their midday rest. Prince Frederick had greeted her with a formality that gradually eased as they rode deeper into the woods, the constraints of protocol loosening in the absence of observing eyes, until they were conversing with a naturalness that Catherine would not have thought possible between a spinster of no particular consequence and one of the most eligible men in the kingdom. "Tell me honestly, Miss Ashford," he said as they paused beside a stream where the horses might drink, "why have you been overlooked for 6 seasons? I confess I struggle to comprehend how a woman of evident intelligence and character could fail to attract serious notice." Catherine dismounted before responding, using the action to buy time, while she considered how much truth to offer. He joined her at the water's edge, and together they stood, watching the current flow over smooth stones, the moment stretching between them with a quality she might have called comfortable, if it were not also charged with something more complex. "Your Grace asks a question whose answer would require a level of candor that might shock you," she said finally. "I have found that what passes for conversation in ballrooms and drawing rooms rewards neither honesty nor depth, and I proved constitutionally incapable of the performance required. Gentlemen seek wives who will ornament their homes and produce heirs without challenging their certainties or requiring intellectual engagement. I fear I failed on all counts except perhaps the last, and that particularly disqualified me." "So you were rejected," he said quietly, "for possessing the very qualities that make you interesting." Catherine turned to face him, drawn by something in his tone that suggested he spoke from experience rather than idle sympathy. "I suspect your Grace has never been rejected in his life, so I cannot imagine you truly understand what that word means when applied repeatedly over years, until it becomes not just a description of what happened, but of who you are." For a long moment he was silent, his gaze fixed on the flowing water as though seeing something in its patterns that only he could perceive. Then, with deliberate care, he said, "Would it surprise you to learn that I have been rejected, Miss Ashford? Not in the manner you describe, certainly, but rejected nonetheless in ways that cut perhaps more deeply, because they concerned not my circumstances but my character." Catherine's breath caught at this unexpected confession. "I confess I struggle to imagine circumstances under which anyone would reject a prince." A bitter smile touched his lips. "That is because you conceive of rejection only in terms of marriage proposals. But there are other forms of being found wanting, of being dismissed as insufficient. My father believes I lack the ruthlessness required for effective rule, that my interest in justice and reform demonstrates weakness rather than strength. My brother, the heir, views me as a competitor to be managed rather than an ally to be trusted. The court sees me as an inconvenience, too serious for their entertainments, but not serious enough to merit genuine respect." He paused, then added with painful honesty, "I have spent years being overlooked, Miss Ashford, not for lack of title or fortune, but for possessing convictions that others find tiresome or threatening. So when I tell you I understand rejection, please believe that I speak not from imagination, but from lived experience." The vulnerability in his admission struck Catherine with unexpected force. This prince, who should have been able to command whatever he desired revealing, instead a loneliness that mirrored her own. She found herself responding before caution could intervene, drawn forward by recognition of a kindred spirit in an unlikely guise. "I judged you wrongly," she said softly. "I assumed your interest was curiosity about an oddity, the scholarly spinster produced for your amusement. I did not think, I could not imagine, that you might seek something more than performance or pretense." "I have had more than sufficient pretense," he replied, and now his grey eyes held hers, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "When I arrived in this county, I did so hoping to escape the suffocating falseness of court, to find perhaps someone capable of genuine discourse who might see me as something beyond my title. Your brother mentioned your accomplishments, and I confess I seized upon that information because it offered hope, that there might be someone here capable of conversation that extended beyond weather and gossip. Catherine felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the defensive walls she had built so carefully over 6 seasons of disappointment. Then I shall endeavour to provide more substantial discourse, Your Grace, though I warn you that my opinions on matters of state and history are neither conventional nor particularly respectful of traditional authority. His laugh rang genuine through the quiet woods, startling the horses and sending a thrush bursting from nearby branches. Miss Ashford, I would be devastated if they were. Please, I beg you, tell me your most heretical opinions, your most radical thoughts, and spare me nothing out of misplaced deference to my position. And so she did. As they remounted and continued deeper into the forest, Catherine found herself speaking with a freedom she had never experienced in male company, her thoughts flowing without the constant editing that usually constrained her. She told him her views on the obligations of nobility toward those less fortunate, on the failures of primogeniture to ensure competent leadership, on the ways in which laws disadvantaged women and the poor while protecting the powerful. She expected him to retreat, to register the polite disapproval that usually greeted such observations, but instead he engaged with every point, sometimes agreeing, sometimes challenging, but always with genuine interest and respect that transformed their exchange into something resembling an intellectual duel between equals. The hours passed without notice, the autumn sun tracking across the sky until it hung low enough to paint the forest in amber and rose. They spoke of history and philosophy, of books they had read and ideas they had encountered, of dreams they harboured and frustrations they carried. Catherine learned that beneath his princely exterior existed a man of remarkable depth, someone who had devoted years to studying governance and justice, who maintained correspondence with reformers across the continent, who chafed against the limitations of his position and longed to effect meaningful change. In turn, she found herself revealing aspects of herself she had learned to hide, the passion for learning that had been mocked as unfeminine, the loneliness of being different in a world that rewarded conformity, the grief of watching 6 years pass while she stood still, accumulating the dust of rejection until she had begun to wonder if she existed at all beyond society's verdict that she was insufficient. "You exist," Frederick said with quiet vehemence when she voiced this fear. "You exist more vividly than anyone I have encountered in years of court life, surrounded by people who have perfected the art of seeming without being. Miss Ashford, I came to this county hoping to find respite from falseness, but I did not dare hope to find someone who might understand, who might see me as I am, rather than as what I represent." The vulnerability in his voice matched what Catherine felt expanding in her own chest, a terrifying opening of something she had thought permanently sealed. "Your Grace," she began, then stopped, recognizing the inadequacy of titles between them now. "Frederick," she amended, using his name for the first time, and feeling the intimacy of it like a touch. "I do see you, and what I see is not at all what I expected to find in a prince. But I must warn you that I come with considerable damage, with walls built high enough that I'm not certain they can be dismantled, with a certainty born of 6 seasons that I am not what anyone seeks." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, his touch warm through her riding glove. "Then perhaps we might dismantle those walls together, Catherine," he said, her name in his mouth carrying a weight that made her breath catch. "And perhaps I might convince you that what you are is exactly what I have been seeking, though I did not know it until I met you, a woman whose worth has nothing to do with society's judgments and everything to do with the remarkable person you have proven yourself to be, despite those judgments attempting to diminish you." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, shocked by the sudden upwelling of emotion after so long spent keeping feeling carefully contained. "I don't know how to hope anymore," she confessed. 6 seasons have taught me that hope is simply a prelude to disappointment, that it is safer to expect nothing than to allow myself to imagine that anything might be different. "Then don't hope yet," Frederick replied, his thumb tracing circles on her palm through the thin leather. "Simply allow possibility, allow this moment and the next, and the one after that, without demanding that they promise anything beyond themselves. Can you do that?" Looking into his eyes, seeing in them a reflection of her own longing tempered by caution, Catherine found herself nodding. "I can try," she whispered, and in that moment something that had been frozen inside her for 6 long years began, almost imperceptibly, to thaw. The following weeks unfolded like nothing Catherine had ever experienced, a progression of encounters that gradually eroded her certainty that she was unworthy of notice while simultaneously building something new in place of that old conviction, something fragile and precious and terrifying in its implications. Frederick called at Ashford House with a frequency that set the entire household on edge, though his visits were marked more by conversation than by formal courtship rituals. They walked the estate's grounds as autumn deepened into its full glory, the trees aflame with colour that would soon give way to winter's bareness, and they spoke of everything and nothing, serious discourse interspersed with moments of unexpected laughter that surprised Catherine each time it emerged from her throat, rusty from disuse. He brought her books from his personal library, volumes of political philosophy and historical analysis that no one had ever thought to offer a woman, and they debated the contents with an intensity that scandalized Lady Ashford, who felt certain that proper courtship should involve more flowers and poetry, and less discussion of social contract theory. He sought her opinion on matters of genuine import, sharing with her his plans for reforms he hoped to implement when he came into greater power, listening with evident respect when she offered suggestions or challenged his assumptions. Slowly, incrementally, Catherine began to believe that his interest might be genuine rather than temporary, that perhaps, impossibly, she had found someone who valued precisely those qualities that others had rejected, but society, of course, would not allow such an unusual connection to develop without comment. The whispers began almost immediately, speculation about what the prince could possibly see in a woman, who had failed to attract any notice for 6 seasons. Lady Pemberton, whose final ball Catherine had missed, pronounced herself astonished that a man of Prince Frederick's standing would waste his time on a blue-stocking spinster when so many more appropriate young ladies remained available. The mothers of those young ladies viewed Catherine with suspicion and resentment, as though she had somehow cheated by attracting royal attention without possessing the beauty or fortune that should have been prerequisites. Even some of those who had known Catherine all her life struggled to reconcile the unremarkable woman they had dismissed with the one who now rode beside the prince, walked with him through gardens, sat with him in drawing rooms engaged in conversation that excluded others through its very depth and complexity. The pressure of observation became suffocating. Every interaction was analysed, every word overheard and repeated, with embellishments that transformed innocent exchanges into scandalous intimacies. Catherine felt herself retreating under the weight of scrutiny, the old instinct to make herself small and unobtrusive, reasserting itself even as Frederick's attentions suggested she might be allowed to be large, to take up space, to exist without apology. The contradiction created a tension that built until it felt like something must break, either the fragile connection developing between them or Catherine herself, worn down by the impossibility of reconciling who she had been forced to be with, who Frederick seemed to believe she could become. The crisis arrived on an evening in late October, at a dinner party, hosted by Lord Blackwood, where Catherine and Frederick had both been invited among a company of some 30 guests. The meal proceeded with the usual formal tedium, courses following one another with mechanical precision, while conversation remained safely superficial, until Lady Blackwood, emboldened by wine and perhaps by malice, addressed Catherine directly across the table, with a question calculated to embarrass. "Miss Ashford, we are all simply consumed with curiosity about your friendship with His Grace. Tell us, what could you possibly discuss that holds his interest? Surely not fashion or the usual feminine accomplishments. Do you perhaps share an interest in, what is it, medieval history? How very unusual." The table fell silent, all eyes turning toward Catherine, with expressions ranging from genuine curiosity to barely concealed schadenfreude. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, the old familiar shame threatening to overwhelm her, the certainty that she was being mocked for daring to be different, for failing to be what a woman should be. Her throat closed around any response she might have offered, and in that moment she was once again the rejected girl standing against the ballroom wall, invisible and unworthy. But then Frederick's voice cut through the silence, his tone carrying an edge of steel that silenced the incipient laughter. "Lady Blackwood, I find your question puzzling. Miss Ashford and I discuss matters of substance that are evidently beyond your comprehension if you must ask what we find to speak about. Perhaps, if you had applied yourself to learning rather than gossip, you might possess the capacity for genuine discourse instead of idle speculation about what others discuss when you are not present to contaminate the conversation with your petty observations." The gasps that followed were audible, shock rippling through the assembled company at such a direct rebuke from royalty. Lady Blackwood's face cycled through shades of red before settling into a mottled purple, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Lord Blackwood half rose from his seat, uncertain whether to defend his wife or apologize to the prince. But Frederick had already turned his attention to Catherine, his expression softening as he met her gaze across the table. "Miss Ashford, I find myself suddenly weary of company that values form over substance. Would you do me the honor of taking a turn in the garden before the evening grows too cold? I believe we left our conversation about the Magna Carta unfinished, and I am eager to hear the remainder of your thoughts on the tension between royal prerogative and baronial rights." It was an offer of escape, and more than that, it was a public declaration of his preference for her company over that of those who mocked her. Catherine found her voice enough to whisper her acceptance, and together they rose and left the dining room, leaving behind a tableau of stunned faces and whispered commentary that would fuel gossip for weeks. In the garden, beneath a sky brilliant with stars unobscured by clouds, Catherine felt something break open inside her, not shattering but unfurling, like a flower that had been clenched tight against cold, finally allowing itself to bloom. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, though her voice carried gratitude rather than reproach. "You've made an enemy of Lady Blackwood and likely half the county for my sake." Frederick took her hands in his touch warm in the October chill. "I have made enemies of worse than Lady Blackwood, Catherine, and for far less worthy causes. I will not stand by while others diminish you for possessing the very qualities I have come to value beyond measure." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a decision forming. "I came to this county seeking escape, and found instead something I had stopped believing possible. I found someone who sees me not as a title but as a man, someone whose mind challenges and delights me, whose spirit has survived 6 seasons of rejection with her integrity intact, whose worth is so evident to me that I marvel at the blindness of others who failed to recognize it." Catherine felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the intensity of his regard, by words she had never thought to hear directed at her. "Frederick, I can't. I'm not what princes marry. I have no fortune, no beauty, no connections that would make such a match advantageous for you. I am simply a spinster, who reads too much and speaks too freely, who has been rejected by every suitor because I am not what a wife should be." "Then perhaps," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that allowed no argument, "I do not want what a wife should be. Perhaps I want exactly what you are, a woman of intelligence and integrity, of courage and compassion, whose companionship I value more than all the fortune and beauty and connections in the kingdom." "Catherine Ashford, I am asking if you would consider accepting what 6 seasons of unworthy gentlemen were too blind to offer, my hand, my heart, my life, if you can find it in yourself to trust that what I see when I look at you is not an oddity or a convenience, but the woman I wish to spend my days with, learning from you and, if you'll allow it, loving you. The proposal hung between them, impossible and perfect, everything Catherine had stopped letting herself imagine. She looked at him, this prince who had appeared in her life like something from a story, and saw not just his title or his position, but the man beneath, someone as lonely and misunderstood as herself, someone who had recognized in her what she had struggled to see in herself. The risk terrified her, the possibility of hope after so long without it, the vulnerability of allowing herself to believe that this might be real rather than another variation of rejection waiting to happen. But looking into Frederick's eyes, seeing the anxious hope there that mirrored her own fear, Catherine realized that some risks were worth taking, that some moments demanded courage equal to 6 seasons of endurance. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying all the weight of her decision. Yes, I will marry you, though I warn you that I will likely continue to be difficult and opinionated, and everything that a proper princess should not be. His smile transformed his entire face as he pulled her into his arms, propriety forgotten, in the privacy of the darkened garden. Catherine, I am counting on it, he murmured against her hair, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed, like being seen completely for the first time in her life, like the ending and beginning of something all at once. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through the county and beyond, reactions ranging from astonishment to outrage to, in some quarters, grudging acknowledgement that perhaps the prince had seen something others had missed. Lady Blackwood, still smarting from Frederick's public rebuke, sniffed that it was a very odd match, and likely to end badly when the initial infatuation wore off, and he realized he'd tied himself to a blue stocking with no notion of how to be a proper princess. Lady Pemberton, more generous in her response, declared, herself not at all surprised, she had always known Catherine possessed hidden depths, though she conveniently forgot the years of disregarding those depths in favor of more traditionally accomplished young ladies. The young ladies themselves responded with varying degrees of envy and resentment, unable to comprehend how someone they had dismissed as hopeless competition had secured the most eligible match any of them could have imagined. But Catherine found, somewhat to her surprise, that she cared less about society's reaction than she would have thought possible. The opinions that had once wielded such power over her seemed diminished now, made small by the transformation that Frederick's love had worked in her understanding of herself. She was still the same woman who had stood unnoticed against ballroom walls for 6 seasons, but she no longer saw that woman as insufficient. Instead, she recognized her as someone who had maintained her integrity in circumstances designed to erode it, who had survived rejection without becoming bitter, who had preserved her capacity for authentic connection through years of being told she was not enough. The rejection had not defined her, she realized. It had refined her, burning away pretense until what remained was solid and true, and Frederick had been able to recognize that truth because he carried something similar in himself. The wedding took place on a December morning, when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns, and the chapel was filled with candlelight that transformed the stone interior into something warm and welcoming. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk, whose simplicity suited her better than the elaborate confections Lydia had initially advocated for, and when she walked down the aisle on Richard's arm, she felt no nervousness, only a profound sense of rightness, of having arrived at last at the place she was meant to be. Frederick waited at the altar with an expression that suggested he felt the same, and when they spoke their vows, Catherine's voice remained steady because she was promising nothing she did not mean, offering nothing she was not prepared to give. The ceremony concluded, they emerged into winter sunlight to find the village gathered despite the cold, people who had known Catherine all her life, now cheering for the local spinster, who had become a princess, their pride in her transformation evident despite having contributed nothing to it. The reception afterward was everything such events demanded, elegant and properly formal, but Catherine found moments of genuine connection amid the performance, Lydia embracing her with tears of happiness, Richard expressing quiet pride in his unusual sister, even their mother admitting that perhaps Catherine's oddities had served her better than conventional accomplishments would have. But the moment Catherine treasured most came late in the evening, when she and Frederick managed to steal away from the festivities to the library at Ashford House, that quiet room where she had spent so many hours escaping into books when the present felt unendurable. Standing among the familiar shelves with Frederick's arms around her, Catherine felt the full weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment, 6 seasons of rejection that had taught her to value herself independently of others' judgments, that had prepared her to recognize genuine connection when it finally appeared, that had equipped her with the strength required to accept love without losing herself in the process. "What are you thinking?" Frederick asked, his breath warm against her temple. "That I spent 6 years believing I was being rejected," Catherine replied slowly, working through the realization even as she spoke it. "But perhaps what was actually happening was that I was rejecting all the wrong men, refusing to diminish myself to fit their limited expectations, waiting without knowing I was waiting for someone who would value the truth of who I am, rather than demanding I become something else." Frederick's arms tightened around her. "Then I am grateful for their blindness," he said, "because it preserved you for me, for this, for what we will build together." And standing in that library, surrounded by all the books that had sustained her through the hardest years, Catherine understood that her story was not one of rescue or salvation, not a tale of a prince who saw worth where others had seen only deficiency, but rather a story of a woman who had remained true to herself until she encountered someone capable of seeing that self clearly, someone whose own authenticity matched and complemented her own. The rejection had been real, but it had never been a verdict on her value, only a reflection of the values held by those doing the rejecting. 6 seasons had taught her to stand alone, and that strength had prepared her to stand with someone, to build partnership rather than dependence, to create something new without losing what she had fought to preserve. The years that followed brought changes neither Catherine nor Frederick could have fully anticipated when they married on that December morning, though all of them seemed in retrospect to be natural extensions of who they were and what they valued. Catherine did not transform into a conventional princess, much to the consternation of court officials who struggled to reconcile her insistence on continuing her scholarly pursuits with the expectations surrounding her title. She established a salon that brought together thinkers and reformers from across the continent, creating a space where ideas could be debated with the same rigor she had once brought to her solitary studies. And Frederick supported these endeavors with resources and authority that amplified their impact beyond what Catherine could have achieved alone. Together, they worked toward the reforms Frederick had long envisioned, using their position to advocate for changes in laws that disadvantaged women and the poor, for education that extended beyond the privileged classes, for systems of governance that prioritized justice over tradition. Their partnership proved remarkably effective precisely because it was genuine, 2 minds working in concert rather than one deferring to the other, each bringing strengths that complemented the other's gaps, each challenging the other to think more deeply and act more courageously. The court never quite knew what to make of them, this prince who deferred to his wife's judgment on intellectual matters, and this princess who attended parliamentary debates and published papers under her own name rather than confining herself to charitable work and decorative functions. But gradually, resistance gave way to grudging respect as the outcomes of their efforts became undeniable, as laws changed and institutions adapted and lives improved in measurable ways because 2 people had refused to accept that things must remain as they had always been. Catherine maintained contact with Ashford House, watching with pleasure as Lydia made her own excellent match to a young man of good character who valued her kindness more than her beauty, as Richard's fortunes improved, with Catherine's assistance in establishing more profitable management of the estate's resources. As even her mother eventually acknowledged that perhaps there were multiple paths to fulfillment beyond the conventional trajectory she had envisioned for her daughters. The village that had watched Catherine stand unnoticed for 6 seasons now told stories about the local girl who had become princess and used her position to improve lives rather than simply enjoy its privileges, and children growing up heard those stories and learned that worth could manifest in unexpected forms. That rejection by those who failed to see clearly need not determine one's ultimate value or trajectory. 10 years after their wedding, Catherine stood in the library of the London residence she and Frederick maintained, surrounded by books and papers related to her current research project, when he entered, carrying their daughter, a serious-faced child of 5 who had inherited her mother's intellectual intensity and her father's determination to use position for purpose. "Mama's working," the child observed with the certainty of one who had seen this scene many times. "Should we come back later?" Catherine set down her pen and held out her arms, gathering her daughter close, while Frederick settled beside them on the sofa. "Never," she said firmly. "Work is important, but you are more important, and one of the things I hope you learn is that it's possible to do meaningful work while also being present for those you love. Your father and I manage it, though not without effort." The child seemed satisfied with this answer, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a moment before Frederick spoke, his voice carrying the reflective quality Catherine had come to recognize as prelude to deeper conversation. "Do you ever think about those 6 seasons? About what might have happened if any of those gentlemen had seen what I eventually saw and offered for you before we met?" Catherine considered the question seriously, as she considered all Frederick's questions, because he asked them sincerely and deserved thoughtful response. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I don't believe any other outcome would have brought me here, to this life, to you, to her." She brushed a hand over their daughter's dark hair. "Those 6 seasons felt like rejection at the time, and they were, but they were also preparation and protection, keeping me from settling for less than what I needed, even when I didn't yet know what I needed looked like. If I had married in my first season, I would have shaped myself to fit someone else's expectations and lost the very qualities that eventually drew you to me. The rejection preserved me until I encountered acceptance that didn't require transformation." Frederick leaned over to kiss her temple, a gesture so familiar now that Catherine barely registered it consciously, though her body always responded with a warmth that had not diminished despite years of marriage. "Then I am grateful for every gentleman who overlooked you," he murmured, "because their blindness meant you were still available when I finally had the wisdom to look for substance rather than surface, for authenticity rather than performance. 6 seasons of their rejection gave me a lifetime of your presence, and I consider it a bargain, almost too generous to accept." Their daughter, growing restless with adult conversation, wriggled free and ran to the window to watch carriages passing in the street below. And Catherine took the opportunity to study Frederick's profile, this man who had appeared in her life when she had stopped believing anyone would see her truly, and who had proven day after day across 10 years that his initial recognition had been neither fluke nor temporary fascination, but genuine perception of qualities that remained as valued now as they had been in that first encounter. She thought of the young woman she had been, standing against ballroom walls convinced of her own insufficiency, and wished she could send a message back across time to tell that woman that the rejection was not verdict but redirection, that worth existed independent of others' ability to perceive it, that patience and integrity would be rewarded not because the universe was just, but because maintaining truth eventually attracted others who valued truth, that 6 seasons of waiting would conclude not with settling, but with finding someone worth the wait. But perhaps that young woman would not have believed such a message, would have dismissed it as the kind of empty comfort offered to console the unconsolable. Perhaps she had needed to live through all 6 seasons, to feel the full weight of society's judgment and survive it, to build walls high enough to protect her essential self and then learn to lower them for someone who deserved access. Perhaps the rejection had been necessary after all, not because it taught her to be different, but because it taught her to remain the same, despite pressure to transform, to value her own judgment more than others' opinions, to trust that somewhere existed someone who would see what she offered and recognize its value, rather than demanding she offer something else. As evening drew close and lamps were lit throughout the house, as their daughter was carried off by her nurse for supper and bed, Catherine and Frederick remained in the library, working on separate projects, but together in the room, the silence between them comfortable and rich with unspoken understanding. This was what Catherine had imagined when she thought of partnership, not the performance of marriage she had observed in society, but genuine collaboration between equals who respected each other's work and supported each other's dreams, who could sit in the same space without needing constant interaction, but found joy in proximity, who had built something together that was greater than either could have achieved alone. The story that had begun with 6 seasons of rejection had transformed into something she could not have imagined during those painful years, into a life of purpose and connection that validated every moment of endurance required to reach it. She thought of all the young women currently standing against ballroom walls, bearing their own rejections and wondering if they would ever be seen, and she wished she could tell them that rejection by the wrong people simply meant preservation for the right ones, that worth unrecognized was still worth, that patience and integrity would carry them through to something better than settling for acceptance from those who did not truly see them. But she could not reach them with words, could only live the truth of her own story and hope that somehow it would ripple outward to encourage others who needed encouragement. That night, as she prepared for bed in the room she shared with Frederick, Catherine stood before her mirror and studied her reflection, seeing there not the spinster who had been rejected for 6 seasons, but the woman who had survived those rejections and built a life of meaning in their aftermath. She was 34 now, the age at which society had long since written her off, and she was more fully herself than she had been at 18 when the rejections began. The years had marked her face with lines that spoke of laughter and thought rather than merely age, had brought confidence in place of the defensive walls she had once required, had transformed her from someone who endured invisibility to someone who wielded visibility with purpose and grace. Frederick appeared behind her in the mirror, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the question he posed so often because he genuinely wanted to know, because her thoughts mattered to him as much now as they had when he first sought her out for conversation that extended beyond superficiality. "That I would not change anything," Catherine replied, surprising herself with the realization even as she spoke it. "Not the 6 seasons, not the rejection, not the pain of believing myself insufficient. All of it brought me here, made me who I am, prepared me to recognize you and to be recognized by you. If I could go back and alter my story to remove the difficult parts, I would not do so, because the difficult parts were integral to reaching the good ones." Frederick's arm circled her waist, drawing her back against his chest. "Then we are both grateful for your 6 seasons, he murmured into her hair, "because they shaped the extraordinary woman I had the privilege to marry, and I would not change a single thing about her, even if I possessed the power to do so." Standing there in the lamplight with Frederick's arms around her and the comfortable sounds of their household settling into evening quiet, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion, not because her life was finished, but because she had arrived at understanding. She had not been rejected for 6 seasons because she was insufficient. She had been preserved through 6 seasons until she encountered someone capable of seeing sufficiency clearly, and that preservation had required maintaining her essential self despite enormous pressure to transform into something more conventionally acceptable. The rejection had never been verdict, only redirection. The waiting had not been wasted time, only preparation. And the prince, who eventually saw her worth, had done so not because he possessed superhuman perception, but because he was looking for something real in a world of performance, seeking authenticity in an age of artifice, hoping to find someone whose depths matched his own. The story that would be told in years to come, passed down through generations as family history and court legend, would focus on the unlikely romance between prince and spinster, on the fairy tale quality of royal notice falling upon someone society had overlooked. But Catherine knew the deeper truth, that this was not a story about rescue or transformation, not a tale of someone granting worth to the worthless, but rather a story about recognition. Frederick had not made her valuable through his attention. He had simply been perceptive enough to see value that had always existed, to recognize in her qualities that others had dismissed or failed to notice, to understand that 6 seasons of rejection by the wrong people meant nothing compared to acceptance from someone who saw clearly. She had not needed a prince to validate her worth. She had needed someone who could perceive worth that existed independent of validation, who valued substance over surface, who sought partnership rather than ornament. That such a person happened to be a prince was incidental to the deeper story of 2 lonely people finding each other in a world that had failed to understand either of them, of 2 minds recognizing kinship across barriers of circumstance and expectation, of 2 hearts learning to trust after years of protecting themselves against judgment and rejection. The rejection had been real, but it had never been true. The worth had been there all along, waiting not to be created but to be seen. And in the end, being seen by the right person had mattered infinitely more than being overlooked by countless wrong ones. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from.